I'd like to thank, of course, the programming team and all those here at the Ismaili Center, members of the Jamaat present for their hard work in putting on this fine and, I must say, most worthwhile event. It's my first time back here since the opening of the Aga Khan Park, and my second time here since the opening of the Ismaili Center and the Aga Khan Museum by His Highness. And this beautiful complex, which is unique in this country, this beautiful complex of harmonious gardens and superb architecture is such a gift to our city. I'm a Toronto hometown boy, and such a gift to our country. This space and the events that are held here in these precincts, such as this evening's, are a splendid witness to the vibrancy of the Shia Ismaili community here in Canada. And I am very blessed to be with you all again. It's also an honor to be here to offer some remarks of welcome and to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Eboo Patel. Before introducing Eboo, please permit me this opportunity to offer some very brief reflections on religious difference, the nature of a publicly lived faith, and what I would say is its essential presence within our common life as Canadians. Let me begin by saying this. A common civic life without debate and encounter between us is no civic life at all. Too often in our country, these days, we either shy away from engaging our fellow citizens or we engage them in a confrontational way, often via the perceived anonymity of what I would say is the profoundly disconnected world of social media. This is emblematic of an increasingly uncommon life, and it is not sustainable. As Aristotle asserted in his Nicomachean Ethics, the pursuit of the common good is founded upon ensuring human flourishing. This understanding of what is at the core of our social, economic, and political lives has been affirmed by many since Aristotle, including by St. Thomas Aquinas from my own Catholic tradition. I would assert that the common good of human flourishing must be at the very heart of our understanding of what pluralism is. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, the advancement of human flourishing and the associated commitment to pluralism must be deeply rooted in the championing of human dignity above all else in our common life. And I say above all else because this dignity, this human dignity, comes directly from God. In championing human dignity, we must not only recognize but respect that we believe different things and that we hold different views on what is most important in human life. Often these views and beliefs are profoundly different and can cause us to feel perhaps ill at ease, or they might at times even raise our ire. So long as all that we say and do is said and done charitably, in a manner that is respectful of the other and their inherent human dignity, then we can agree to disagree. Even in that disagreement, we can encounter one another. As a Catholic Christian, my understanding of the dignity of the human person is grounded in my belief that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. I believe that this reality was made present among us when God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, he who is fully human and fully divine, without commixtion or confusion in his two natures and his two wills, one in the Holy Trinity, one God in three persons. He is the Savior and the Redeemer of the world. Now, many of you here reject this view, and you affirm a belief radically different to my own. Yet here we are, side by side, living in this place we call Canada, our country. Our common life together is enriched by our difference, as well as by our shared goals for this country and, please God, for each other. His Highness, at the opening of the Global Center for Pluralism in May of this year, put it simply, and I quote, "Connection does not necessarily mean agreement. It does not mean that we want to eliminate our differences or erase our distinctions, far from it. What it does mean is that we connect with one another in order to learn from one another and to build our future together. Pluralism does not mean the elimination of difference, but the embrace of difference. Genuine pluralism understands that diversity does not weaken a society, it strengthens it." Unquote. So as a Christian, I am blessed to be with you here tonight, as we embrace our differences and rejoice in the common dignity we share and the common life which flows from it. So let me now introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Eboo Patel. Eboo is a leading voice in the movement for interfaith cooperation, and he is the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, IFYC, a national nonprofit working to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. I love that way of putting it, to make it a social norm. He is the author of Acts of Faith, Sacred Ground, and Interfaith Leadership. He's been named by U.S. News and World Report as one of America's best leaders of 2009. Eboo served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He's a regular contributor to the public conversation around religion in the United States and a frequent speaker on this topic of religious pluralism. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship and obviously had some really great debates with Talib, so I want to hear about those. I'll talk about the Order of Malta. I want to hear about your debates. For over 15 years, Eboo has worked with governments, social sector organizations, college and university campuses to help realize a future where religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. I think you'll find, and those of you familiar with his work will expect, that our guest this evening will assert the importance of a public faith and the essential role it plays in our world and in our community. Eboo has rightly affirmed that, and I quote, "We will not save ourselves and the next generation of every faith by taming religious energy, but by emboldening it." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Eboo Patel.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. I mean, what a beautiful space this is. What a terrific job you all did in creating this. There's a beautiful line in the Muslim tradition, which many of you, of course, know, that God is beauty, God is beautiful and loves beauty. That's what this is, right? You have created a space in which beauty can flourish, including the beauty of these kinds of conversations. So thank you for inviting my family and me here this evening. I'm not in the habit of spying on other people's conversations, but I did overhear this on the way in. Somebody said, "What is a Chicagoan doing offering one of the Canada 150 lectures?" And the other person was like, "He's just like every other American in Toronto. After the election, he's looking at real estate." So after I tried that joke out of my wife, she gave it a 5 out of 10. But I appreciate how ripe the audience is tonight, though. As you can see, my tone is going to be a bit informal this evening. I incline towards more conversational talks, but the topic, as Andrew and Talib mentioned, is deadly serious, right? And that's the topic of how do you build a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? Let's pause for a moment and just note how rare this is in human history. Peter Berger, the great sociologist of religion, points out that what makes the modern era distinct from previous eras of human civilization is that people from different backgrounds are in frequent and intense interaction with one another as a matter of course in our time, which he dates basically from the end of World War II. He points out that most of our ancestors lived most of their lives within physical or psychological bubbles of homogeneity. They effectively only interacted with people who were similar to them. Again, if that was not physically the case, it was psychologically the case. We moderns, we interact with, as Andrew said, people who are different than us all the time. Berger points out that this makes 3 things especially difficult. marking our lives as distinct from the lives of our ancestors. Number one, individual identity is made much more difficult. Our ancestors viewed their identities as fate. Berger says we view our identities as a matter of choice. This is one of the consequences of the pluralization of modernity. We view our identities as choice. They viewed their identities as fate. Number two, religious communities once had a taken for granted status. You just went to Jamaat Khana on Friday nights. That's what Jamaat Khana was, that's what Friday nights were made for, to go to Jamaat Khana. Why else would God have made Friday nights except that you could go to Jamaat Khana? My grandmother tried that on me a handful of times. I could think of lots of other reasons Friday nights were created. She, having grown up in what we might think of as the pre-modern era, couldn't. Sunday mornings were made for church. Religious communities have lost their taken for granted status. They are now voluntary communities. Religious communities have to convince their adherents to join, to be a part, to come to a lecture of an American they've never heard of on a Saturday night, rather than one of a million other things they could do. It makes the life of a religious community and the life of its leadership significantly more challenging. And of course, the third challenge that the pluralization of modernity presents is, how are we supposed to interact with each other? Once we answer the who am I question, we have to answer the how do I relate to you and what do we do together questions. Michael Walzer, the political philosopher, builds on Berger's sociological work and says, political philosophy for generations, centuries really, from the time of the Greeks, has believed that the only way you could have diversity in a society is if that society was a dictatorship. If you wanted a democracy, you had to have homogeneity. How would people, Walzer points out, this is what political philosophers for generations believe, how would people from one ethnic or religious or racial group ever allow somebody from a different ethnic or racial or religious group to rule over them? That was standard thinking in political philosophy, frankly, until the religiously diverse democracies of North America. We are amongst the first societies in human histories that believed that people coming from the four corners of the earth, speaking different languages, praying to God in different ways, including not at all, could build together nations. That is a stunning feature of modern life. We should pause and recognize how remarkable that is. Why is it so difficult? Well, as Talib knows, you don't graduate from Oxford without being able to define your terms. So allow me to be geeky for a second and define my terms: healthy, religiously diverse democracy. What is a democracy? Not just a society where people elect their representatives. That is a necessary but not sufficient definition. A democracy is a place where people can make their personal convictions public. People can make their personal convictions public. What is diversity? Diversity, as Andrew pointed out earlier, is not just the differences you like. It is also the differences you don't like. That might sound stunningly simple, but if my kid's elementary school is any indication of how we talk about diversity in the 21st century to young kids, it makes it sound like it's all samosas and egg rolls. Everything that tastes good. Celebrate diversity. Diversity is our strength. Every once in a while, I'm like, when do they teach you that diversity is somebody articulating a doctrine that you disagree with? A family who talks to their kids, or a set of kids who talks to their parents in a way that you think is off limits. The eating of foods or the ingesting of other substances that you think is evil. And all of those people live in close quarters with each other. And they serve in the PTA, and they teach in schools, and they do surgeries in hospitals. That's diversity. What about religion? Religion, per the great theologian Paul Tillich, is about ultimate concerns, the things that really matter. Why were we born? What is a good life? What happens to people after they die? What separates them? religiously diverse democracy. Now we have a sense of why political philosophers thought that this was a recipe for, frankly, civil war. People are able to make their disagreements on matters of ultimate concern public in a religiously diverse democracy. That's a tense society. What does it mean for that to be healthy? I have a couple things to say on this. Number one, part of the definition, I think, of a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is a place in which people who have fundamental disagreements on some things are still able to work together on other things. Let me put it this way. How would you feel if you were scheduled for a heart surgery next week and you got a phone call saying that the two-person operating team, the two surgeons, have just discovered that they have an irreconcilable difference on matters of Middle East politics, or choose your hot-button issue, abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, Americans, whatever. Your two surgeons have a disagreement on that issue. It's irreconcilable. They won't work together anymore. Your heart surgery is canceled. How do you have a religiously diverse democracy unless people who disagree on some fundamental things are willing to work together on other fundamental things? And if heart surgery is on the high end of the intensity scale, let's go down. Should they not serve on the PTA together? Should one not student teach in the other's classroom? Should they not coach football together or basketball? What should they cancel? What should they refuse to do with one another because they disagree on something that is extremely important? How do you have a religiously diverse democracy, in other words, unless you cultivate the ethic of pluralism? I am here obviously distinguishing between these two terms, diversity and pluralism. It's more than simply a linguistic trick. Let me again define. Diversity, the way that Diana Eck at Harvard likes to speak of this, is simply the fact of people from different identities and backgrounds in close quarters. It says nothing about how they relate to one another. Diversity can just as easily become outright conflict as it can become interfaith cooperation. Diversity is just a sociological fact. Pluralism is an achievement. Pluralism is what Andrew was talking about, a common life together. Pluralism, the way we define it at Interfaith Youth Corps, has three parts: respect for people's diverse identities, recognizing that diversity is not just the differences you like. You still respect people's particularity. Number two, relationships between diverse communities. And number three, a commitment to the common good. I mean, that's embodied here tonight, right? At the Ismaili Center, a place that is an expression of the Shia Imami Ismaili Tariqa. There are people from a range of religious and philosophical backgrounds. A committed Catholic Christian came up and offered a generous articulation of his particular doctrine. There was a statement of a contribution of 1 million hours of service to the Canadian Commonwealth. This is a space that is endeavoring to respect particular identities, recognizing that there's going to be differences and disagreements, that is cultivating relationships between diverse peoples and communities, and that is making contributions to the common good. The way Walzer puts it is this: how do we embrace difference and maintain a common life? How do we embrace difference and maintain a common life? So the rest of my talk is going to be an endeavor to answer that question. But I actually want to flip it around a little bit, because I know here that I speak to a range of particular communities, people who are invested in a Catholic Christian community, people who are invested in the Ismaili Tariqa and the Ismaili community. For those of us who have such investments in particularity, our challenge, I think, is reversed. It is this: how do we maintain our difference, not melt into the ether? How do we maintain that difference and embrace a common life? If the challenge of a diverse society is how do you embrace difference and maintain a common life, the challenge of the particular community is how do you maintain difference and embrace a common life? How do Ismailis, in other words, not just bunker themselves within the Jamaat? How do they do what the Canadian Jamaat has already done? Build spaces like this that are partially private, partially public. Offer the service ethos of the Ismaili Jamaat to the broader society. I want to go through a series of how this is done. The first is a theology of interfaith cooperation, which is to say, a recognition that deep in our own tradition, there is not just an inspiration, but actually a sacred command to cultivate pluralism. Allow me to tell a story from the Quran. This is a story that I actually discovered in my own re-engagement process with Islam, which happens when I'm in my early 20s at Oxford. Talib always knew who he was. I went through a figuring out process. And a lot of that happened in grad school. So in my re-engagement with Islam and the Ismaili Tariqah, I'm reading the Quran. It's in what I swear is the smallest dormitory room Oxford in its 1,000-year history has ever had, and somehow they set it aside for yours truly. So I'm reading this holy book in this small room, and in Surah 2 of the Holy Quran, I read one of the creation stories in the Muslim tradition, which goes like this. God picks up a lump of clay and gives it his ruh, his breath, and thereby creates Adam, the first human being, the first prophet, the ancestor of us all. And he tells Adam, you are to be my abd and khalifa, my servant and representative upon the planet. You are the steward of my creation. And he calls the angels forth and he says to the angels, I want you to bow to Adam, honor him. I have made him my abd and khalifa. And the angels respond, why would we honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God says, I know what you do not know. He sets up a contest between Adam and the angels. He says to the angels, tell me the names of creation. And the angels say, the only knowledge we have, O God, is to sing the glories of your name. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns to Prophet Adam. He says, you tell me the names. And Adam can do it. Adam can accomplish a task that the angels could not accomplish. And I remember, I'm 22 years old, 23 years old, reading this, and one word sticks out to me, the word names. And actually, a single letter in that word sticks out to me, the S. Why? Because it's not singular. God is not asking the angels or Adam to tell him the name of creation. Creation isn't singular. Creation is diverse. It's plural. It includes the forests and the oceans. It includes the animals and the fields. What knowledge does Adam have that the angels do not possess? Adam can flow with diversity. Adam can tell God the names, plural. The angels can't do that. The angels aren't aware of the diversity of dunya, of life, of earth. This is the distinguishing feature. This is why God makes us, through our ancestor and first prophet, his abd and khalifa. Because we can flow with diversity. Because that's how he's made creation. Because diversity is holy. And so when the angels deny Adam, God looks at them and says, I know what you do not know. You don't know that diversity on earth is holy. You wouldn't be able to flow with that. I vouch for this creature. He didn't say we wouldn't fiddle and destroy, just that we would do other things also. This is one story of a theology of interfaith cooperation. The reason I tell this as a story, without just naming the beautiful verses of the Quran which speak to diversity, God makes us different nations and tribes that we may come to know one another. There's verses upon verses. But this is the creation story. This is the fountainhead. This is where we come from. This is why in the Quranic vision we were created, to be God's servant and representative on a planet in which diversity is holy. This is what we do. Part 2, a history of interfaith cooperation. I mean, these days it is often said when people think of faith being relevant at all, it is only relevant in a negative way, right? What's the line by Jonathan Swift that people do not kill each other so happily except in the name of God? You know, another line by a great author, something along the lines of, there is not enough religion in the world for men to love each other, only enough for them to hate each other, right? So those things are just not entirely true. There is another history when it comes to relationships between religious communities that's far more inspiring than what you read on the front page of the Globe and Mail or of the New York Times, which is to say, there is an inspiring history of interfaith cooperation which gets lost. And so we take the worst news of the time and we project it back into history as if the only things that human beings from different religions have ever done is fought. And we project it into the future as if the only thing we will ever do is fight. And that's just simply not true. Allow me again to use a couple of Muslim examples. In the early years of our beloved Rasulullah's mission, Prophet Muhammad, when he was being hated and hounded by his fellow Meccans for bringing a religion that focused on mercy and monotheism, and that's what Islam comes down to. Rama and La ilaha. That's what it comes down to, right? Mercy and monotheism. He's hated and hounded for this to the point where he fears that these anti-Muslim Meccans will round up every last one of his believers, of his Sahaba, of his companions, and kill them, including himself. So he sends a contingent of his followers to Abyssinia to begin a new Muslim community there. And he's confident that they will be safe in Abyssinia. Why? Abyssinia has a Christian king, a man named the Negus. Abyssinia, by the way, is present-day Ethiopia. And Rasulullah, the Prophet Muhammad, is confident that a Christian king, while not agreeing entirely with the doctrine of this emerging Muslim community, will respect it enough to protect his community. A few of the anti-Muslim Meccans find out what's happening and make their way to Abyssinia and whisper gossipy things in the ear of the Negus and his advisors. Negus begins to get suspicious. He calls Ja'far, the leader of this contingent of Muslims, and the other Muslims to his court. And he says, "Tell me about your faith." Right? And I have this image of the Negus with this, this regal man with this big staff, with his advisors, these bishops with long flowing beards around him, and they're sat on these high thrones. And here's Ja'far and this contingent of scared out of their mind Muslims. And Ja'far, in response to the Negus's question, begins to recite from the verses of the Quran which speak of the holiness of Mary. And the Negus is so moved by this. The sources say that he weeps so fully that his beard is soaked with his tears, his bishops as well. And he stands up and he declares his eternal protection for the Muslim people, and he draws a line with his staff in the dirt, and he says, the difference between your deen, your religion, and mine is no wider than this line in the sand. This is part of the history of interfaith cooperation between Muslims and Christians, and it goes deep. It's a long and beautiful history. Some of the sources say that when Rasulullah first receives revelation in the year 610 in a cave on Mount Hira, he was so afraid, didn't know what had happened to him. This force envelops him. Says Iqra 3 times. Finally, the first verses of what would come to be called the Quran come pouring from his mouth. He goes back and he speaks to the person he trusts and loves most in the world, his wife, Khadija. And his wife says, I don't know what's happened to you either, but I know this: you are too righteous a man for God to forsake you. I will take you to my family member, Waraka. Waraka, who is learned in the scriptures. We will tell him your story. He will relate to us the meaning behind it. So Khadija takes her husband, Muhammad, shaking and shivering, to Waraka in the town square of Mecca, tells this story. Waraka looks Muhammad in the eyes, kisses him on the forehead, and says, verily, the prophet of your people has arrived. Who was Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the western half of the Hijaz of the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century? Waraka was most likely a Christian monk. The sources suggest that he never converts to Islam. Suggest further that the prophet never asks him to. He just respects the flowering of this alternate religious civilization in his own midst. The first person who recognizes the prophethood of Muhammad, at least some of the sources suggest, was Christian. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad welcomes a Christian delegation from the city of Najran. They argue doctrine. They argue theology, most likely the nature of Jesus. When it comes time for the Christians to give their prayers, they ask the prophet if they can have leave of the city to offer their prayers outside of Medina, which means city of the prophet, originally named Yathrib, renamed Medina when Muhammad comes. The prophet says, why leave the city? Pray in my mosque. The prophet in Islam, the last prophet, says to a group of Christians with whom he is arguing doctrine, you have the hospitality of my own mosque, which I built to offer your prayers, which I do not fully agree with. The history of cooperation between different communities runs deep. Don't let anybody ever tell you that people from different religions have only always fought and they only always will. It's just not true. 3, if we are to cultivate an ethos of pluralism, we are going to have a national narrative which articulates and points towards pluralism. There's a great line by the writer Walter Lippmann. The way the world is imagined will govern at any given moment what human beings will do. In other words, narratives matter. The way we speak of our societies, the metaphors and stories that we speak of them in, direct our behavior. Let me give you a very mundane example from my own life. I'm a second-generation immigrant in the United States. I came over when I was very young, 1.5 years old, and for a lot of my life, my grandmother lived with us, and she maintained, as she well should have, a set of ways that are more recognizably Indian than quote-unquote American. And one day at a parent-student function at my elementary school, I was visibly uncomfortable with the Indian clothes that my grandmother was wearing, visibly uncomfortable referring to her as Nanima. I called her stiffly grandma, which she didn't really know how to respond to for the first few times. The next day at school, one of my teachers, Mrs. Pellegrino, called me up to her desk and said, "I just want to let you know, your grandmother from India reminds me of my grandmother from Italy." We're an immigrant society. As soon as you touch American soil and make a contribution, you belong. And instantly I felt more at ease. The narrative, immigrant society, helped place me. It guided the behavior of Mrs. Pellegrino. It helped her carve out a place where I felt I was at home. Theology of interfaith cooperation, a history of interreligious relationships, a national narrative which says all of us have a place here. All of us are contributors. And none of this just happens. None of this falls from the sky. Bridges, our favorite metaphor for interfaith cooperation, they don't rise from the ground. They don't magically appear out of Lake Ontario. People build them. Somebody wrote the term immigrant society into the American narrative. Other people are trying to take it away, actually. Mrs. Pellegrino made a forward move in inviting me up to her desk and saying, "You belong. Your grandmother reminds me of my grandmother." These are my final words to you. What does it mean to take on the responsibility of being an ambassador of pluralism? What does it mean to call oneself an interfaith leader or an interfaith bridge builder, just like some people call themselves environmentalists and cultivate an ethos that the earth is precious and needs to be protected, just like some call themselves human rights activists and cultivate an ethos that all human beings have dignity and that governments better not violate that dignity and ought to actually protect it? We need to have an identity category of people who are committed to and cultivators of pluralism. People who see it as part of their vocation to have the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill set of interfaith bridge building. Just like anything else, this is a challenge. Just like anything else, it requires work. Just like anything else, you can improve at your craft. I leave you with this final story, again from the Muslim tradition, from Farid Aden Attar's Conference of the Birds, a great medieval Sufi Muslim poet who I think tells the story of one of the great interfaith leaders in the history of literature, the Hupo. Here's how the story goes. Back in the time before time, one might say, all the species on earth were happy, all except the birds. All the species on earth had their own guide to God or definition of God himself, except the birds. They were sad and they were forlorn. The Hupo notices. The Hupo has knowledge that the other birds do not have. He tells them, we too have an idea of God. We do have a guide. Its name is the Simurgh, but the great Simurgh lives 7 mountains and valleys away. It is an arduous journey to get to it. And all the birds who at first were very excited to hear that they had a definition and view of God, as long as it would be simulcast into their living rooms on their televisions, all of a sudden didn't want to take this arduous journey over 7 mountains and through 7 valleys. The Simurgh starts to put her interfaith leadership into action. She goes bird by bird to the hawks, to the eagles, to the doves, to the nightingales, and articulates why for that bird being a part of this journey to see the great Simurgh is important. Can you see the interfaith leader going to the Jewish community, and the Ahmadiyya community, and the Ismaili community, and Hanbali Muslims, and Catholic Christians, and articulating to them, based on their own tariqah, if you will, their own interpretation, why participating in a common life is important to them? You get a sense of the early organizational and mobilization skills of the hupo. And over the course of this journey, the birds who undertake it get tired. 7 mountains and 7 valleys, no small thing. And throughout all of it, the hupo has to keep narrating, has to keep telling the story of what they are going to see, has to keep lifting up that theology of interfaith cooperation, has to keep articulating how they are extending the great history of interreligious relationships, has to articulate a grand national narrative, if you will, of what it means to come together in this common journey. They come to the shimmering lake behind which the Simurgh lives. The golden doors part, and before these birds is a mirror. And what they see is a reflection of themselves. Simurgh in Persian, 30 birds. C30, Murgh, birds. What is Atar doing here? He is saying that a community from diverse backgrounds who undertakes an arduous journey together is holy. The holiness that they encounter is themselves in building this community, in going on and completing this journey, in cultivating pluralism, in articulating and embodying a common life. It required a leader. It required that hupo who know, and I leave you with these words, the great secret of this Gwendolyn Brooks poem, poet from the south side of Chicago. She says, "We are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond." Jazakallahu khair. May God give you goodness. Thank you.